In the heart of Chicago, 1884, his shop promised elegance and warmth. He could measure a man without ever writing a number because he didn't need the measurements. He needed the man. What began as whispers about a secretive foreign tailor soon turned into a trail of disappearances that the police couldn't explain and society refused to believe. His garments were masterpieces, coveted by the city's elite, but their true craftsmanship lay hidden in the lining, stitched from flesh that once walked the very streets his customers strolled. By the time the truth surfaced, his work had already outlived its owners. Before we go further into this disturbing chapter of history, take a moment to subscribe to the Macabre Record and share your thoughts in the comments, because what you're about to hear will leave you with questions no history book will ever answer. It begins in the South Loop, a place of constant noise where iron wheels ground against wet rails, horses snorted clouds into the freezing air, and vendors barked their trade into the wind. Yet inside Emil Crane's narrow shop there was only silence. No hum of a sewing machine, no clatter of scissors. Just the slow, deliberate snip of his shears, like a heartbeat measured in steel. Customers said he worked as though he could see beneath the skin, his eyes tracing unseen lines as he cut. Those who came for fittings often found themselves locked in the backroom, Crane circling them without a word, his fingers grazing their shoulders as if weighing not the fabric, but them. Some left uneasy and never returned, others never left at all, and for years no one thought to ask how many coats could be made from a single man. Crane's origins were as clouded as the smoke that clung to the city's factory stacks. He was said to have come from Prussia, carrying only a leather case of tools and a folded letter sealed in wax, its contents never shown to another soul. Some claimed he had been a military tailor, stitching uniforms for men who marched into wars and never came home. Others whispered that he had once been an apprentice to a master who vanished under strange circumstances, leaving his shop and his unfinished garments to Crane. What was certain was that by the spring of 1884, he had carved out a quiet place for himself in Chicago's bustling garment district. His front window displayed only 3 pieces at a time, each one so perfect in form that rival tailors accused him of buying his work from Europe. But anyone who tried to replicate his methods failed, because Crane's process was as meticulous as it was private. The shop was divided by a heavy curtain, the front where customers were measured, and the back where no one was permitted without his invitation. Behind that curtain there was no cutting table, no spools of bright thread, no bolts of fabric stacked against the walls, only a set of iron hooks suspended from the ceiling, a drain cut into the floor, and a workbench stained in ways that no tailor's work should stain wood. His neighbors noticed his strange hours. He would leave at night carrying a large empty sack and return in the early hours of morning, the same sack sagging with weight. When questioned, he would offer a polite, tight-lipped smile, claiming he bought old fabrics from out-of-town traders. But the disappearance of a local dock worker, last seen walking toward Crane's Street in a snowstorm, began to turn those polite smiles into something else: fear. Still, the city was too distracted by labor strikes and outbreaks of disease to pay much attention to one reclusive craftsman. And Crane, sensing this neglect, grew bolder. His coats began to feature linings with an almost translucent sheen, material that whispered beneath the fingertips, warm and supple in a way no wool could be. Clients would stroke the inside with fascination, never realizing they were touching something that once bore a pulse. In time, these linings would become his signature, and the very evidence that would damn him. But in the spring of that year, no one could imagine that each finished garment was not just a creation, but a tomb. The first killing that history would later tie to Emil Crane began not in his shop, but in the back room of a riverside tavern where men from the docks came to drink away their frostbite. It was there, in the flicker of lamplight through dirty glass, that Crane sat quietly at a corner table, his measuring tape curled like a snake in his coat pocket, his eyes fixed on a man named Samuel Harker, a stevedore whose broad shoulders and thick frame made him the kind of specimen a tailor would dream of fitting. Harker was drunk, his laughter loud enough to shake the glassware, and when Crane finally stood to leave, the dockworker followed him out, mumbling about needing a new coat for the coming winter. Witnesses claimed the two men turned down a narrow alley and were swallowed by the darkness. Harker was never seen again. The following week, a new coat appeared in Crane's front window, black, long, with a lining so pale it seemed to glow when the morning light hit the glass. Those who stepped inside to examine it spoke of the uncanny warmth that radiated from within, a warmth that seemed to cling to the wearer even after the coat was removed. But Crane did not put it up for sale. Instead, it hung in the shop window for weeks, drawing in passers-by who pressed their faces to the glass as though looking at something sacred or forbidden. Behind the curtain, Harker's absence was already being stitched into every seam. The lining, though few dared to look closely, was not fabric at all, but something stretched and cured with a craftsman's care, something that carried the faintest ridges of what once had been skin. Crane worked late into the night, humming to himself in a low, tuneless way, his shears gliding through the material with surgical precision. When the coat was finally complete, he did not sell it. He kept it in a locked cabinet, taking it out only to run his fingers along the seams, as though memorizing a map no one else could read. The police chalked Harker's disappearance up to drunken misadventure, as they would with many of Crane's victims. But something shifted in the air that winter. The tailor had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, and the streets of Chicago were about to learn that in Emil Crane's world, a man's worth was not in his coin or his character, but in the cut of his flesh. With Harker gone and no suspicion pressing against his door, Crane's ambition sharpened. The dock workers and street laborers had been easy prey, men whose absences barely stirred the city's conscience, but they were also unremarkable trophies. If he was to refine his craft, he would need finer stock. That opportunity arrived in the form of Edgar Thorne, a young banker with a taste for excess and the kind of vanity that made him an ideal target. Thorne's family fortune had cushioned him from the city's hardships, and his arrogance was a cloak thicker than any Crane could sew. One autumn afternoon, Thorne passed Crane's shop while on his way to the exchange, his attention caught by the black coat in the window. He entered, brushing snow from his hat, and within moments was standing before the tailor's measuring stool. Crane greeted him with the same quiet civility he offered all his patrons, his eyes moving over Thorne's frame with something that felt more like calculation than service. The banker spoke of wanting a winter coat unlike any other, something that would make an impression at the upcoming civic ball. Crane agreed, suggesting a private fitting in the evening to ensure perfection. That night, Thorne arrived alone. Behind the curtain, the shop felt colder than it had that afternoon, though a faint heat pulsed from somewhere deep in the walls. Crane's hands moved quickly, pulling the measuring tape across Thorne's chest, around his shoulders, across his neck. The sound of the tape retracting was the last noise the banker would ever hear. What happened in the hours that followed would remain locked in that room until the coat's completion, a long, charcoal garment with a lining of extraordinary smoothness and a faint, silvery sheen that seemed to shimmer when the light shifted. At the civic ball, Crane himself appeared wearing it, mingling unnoticed among the crowd, his presence ghost-like against the glitter of chandeliers and the swell of music. No one recognized the lining for what it was. They saw only a masterwork, and whispered admiration followed him as he drifted from room to room. Somewhere beneath the music, however, a different kind of murmur was beginning to spread. Questions about why Edgar Thorne had failed to arrive, and why the strange tailor in the corner wore a coat that seemed familiar. The city's elite had just been touched by Crane's work, and they would not realize until too late that he had already chosen his next fitting. The disappearance of Edgar Thorne might have raised alarms under ordinary circumstances, but the circles he moved in were built on discretion and self-preservation. The city's elite preferred whispers to accusations. After all, scandal could tarnish a man's fortune far faster than any crime. When Thorne failed to appear at his banking office, his colleagues muttered about illness, perhaps even a sudden trip to the east. His family issued no public statement, though the shutters on their Lake Michigan estate remained drawn for weeks. And in that silence, Emil Crane found his protection. The coat he had worn to the civic ball was now stored away, replaced in his shop window by a new creation, deep burgundy with a lining that caught the lamplight like wet silk. It drew the attention of society wives and merchants' daughters, each eager to commission a piece that would set them apart from the monotonous fashions imported from New York. Crane entertained them with courteous nods, taking their measurements in the front room before suggesting a final fitting in private. For some, it was nothing more than a quiet encounter with a peculiar craftsman. For others, it was the last doorway they would ever pass through. Neighbors began to notice the irregular comings and goings of Crane's clients, but their concerns were muted by the tailor's growing reputation. His garments had become status symbols, tokens of exclusivity so coveted that the wealthy were willing to overlook the coincidence of missing names and unfinished orders. The city papers, distracted by the ongoing Haymarket labor unrest, barely touched the disappearances, dismissing them as unrelated or the result of transient workers moving on. Meanwhile, Crane's methods grew more refined. The linings of his coats no longer bore even the faintest imperfection. Every seam was seamless, every fold precise. He experimented with dyes to mask telltale textures, perfecting a process that transformed human hide into something indistinguishable from luxury cloth, at least to the untrained eye. Yet, beneath the sheen, his victims remained, preserved in every thread. He began keeping small swatches in a locked drawer, each labelled with the name of its former owner, as if cataloguing a collection. To him, they were not bodies, but materials, each with its own qualities: stretch, resilience, warmth. And in the depths of that private archive, his next project was already taking shape, one that would eclipse every piece he had made before. But for this work, he would need more than a single victim. He would need a matching pair. The idea of taking two at once was not born from necessity, but from an aesthetic impulse. Crane envisioned a matching pair of garments, mirror images in cut and proportion, each lined with material from a single complementary source. It was a challenge that excited him, for it required precision not only in the work, but in the selection. He began watching the streets around the Palmer House Hotel, where travelers from across the country arrived for business and pleasure. In late November, as the first icy fogs rolled off the lake, he noticed them, two brothers, scarcely a year apart in age, carrying matching valises and dressed in the manner of men eager to impress a city that would not remember their names. They were selling insurance policies, staying in a modest boarding house just 3 blocks from Crane's shop. For several days, he followed them at a distance, noting their routines: the elder's habit of smoking outside after dinner, the younger's early morning walks to deliver letters at the post. Their synchronized habits made them ideal. No one would suspect foul play if they vanished together, and no one in Chicago knew them well enough to raise an immediate alarm. On the third evening, Crane approached them under the pretense of offering a discount on tailored overcoats, a gesture he explained as gratitude for newcomers bringing business to the city. Flattered, they agreed to a late-night fitting, the elder brother even joking about sending a coat home to their mother. Behind the curtain, the air was thick with the scent of boiled wool and something metallic that neither could place. Crane worked quickly, his tape gliding across their bodies in practiced arcs, marking details in his mind rather than on paper. When the younger stepped forward for his turn, the elder idly ran a hand over a coat hanging nearby, remarking on its extraordinary warmth. Crane smiled faintly, as though amused by an inside joke, before stepping behind him with a length of cord. By morning, the boarding house keeper noted their absence, but assumed they had left on early business. No inquiries were made, no reports filed. In Crane's workshop, however, the hooks groaned under the doubled weight, and his mind turned over the possibilities: 2 coats, identical, or perhaps one long garment pieced together from both. The decision would have to be perfect, for this was not just another commission, this was a statement. The work began before dawn, when the streets outside were still hushed under a thin crust of frost. Crane moved with a kind of devotional calm, as though this project required not just skill, but reverence. He had chosen not to make 2 coats, as he originally considered, but a single masterpiece, an overcoat that would merge the brothers' proportions into one perfect symmetry. The hides were prepared with the same care a painter might give to stretching a canvas, washed, scraped, treated with an oil blend of his own invention to ensure suppleness. He marveled at their similarity, skin tones nearly identical, textures that responded to the shears in precisely the same way. This was what he had sought, unity of material. The lining was cut in continuous panels, eliminating seams wherever possible, creating the illusion of one uninterrupted expanse. For the outer fabric, Crane chose a rich, dark herringbone wool that concealed the faint irregularities beneath while giving the garment the weight of authority. Every stitch was deliberate, each pass of the needle tightening the bond between form and intent. By the time the coat took shape on the mannequin, it exuded a presence that was almost human, the shoulders rounded just enough to suggest the frame of its former owners. Crane stood back, his eyes narrowing with satisfaction, before adding his hidden mark in the innermost seam, a single looped thread knotted in a way no other tailor would recognize. When it was finished, he did not display it in the shop window. Instead, he wore it himself, stepping out into the street as the city shook off its morning chill. Passers-by glanced at the coat without understanding why it seemed to hold their gaze, why they felt an odd warmth in their chests as it passed. At a merchants' gathering later that week, the coat drew quiet admiration from men who prided themselves on discerning quality, though a few women noted something peculiar about the way it moved, as though it clung too closely to the body beneath. One man, a rival tailor named August Lentz, approached Crane to inquire about the lining. Crane's answer was polite but curt, his smile faint, almost mocking. Lenz left unsatisfied, but his curiosity had been stirred, and once curiosity takes root, it has a way of growing into suspicion. Crane didn't notice Lenz lingering across the street the next evening, watching the shop's front window long after it had gone dark. August Lentz was not a man easily impressed. He had worked the tailoring trade in Chicago for nearly 20 years, and while he had seen fine craftsmanship, he had also seen every manner of deceit, garments passed off as imported when they were made in backrooms, counterfeit fabrics dyed to mimic the real thing. But Crane's coat troubled him in a way no fraud ever had. It was not simply the quality, it was the sensation it produced, a strange heaviness in the air when its wearer entered the room. Lenz could not describe it, only that it was wrong. Over the following week, he found himself detouring past Crane's shop at odd hours, noting the strange rhythms of its operation, the locked door during daylight, the flicker of lamplight well past midnight, the absence of assistants or apprentices. On 2 occasions, he saw Crane return in the pre-dawn hours, carrying a large dark sack, its weight apparent in the way his frame bent slightly as he crossed the threshold. Lenz began asking quiet questions among cloth merchants, wondering if Crane purchased his materials in secret. To his surprise, no one could recall selling him significant quantities of lining fabric or fine wool, at least not enough to match the output he seemed capable of. That discrepancy gnawed at Lenz's mind. Late one evening, he stationed himself in the doorway of a tobacconist across the street, his hat pulled low, his pipe smoke curling into the cold air. He watched as a man entered Crane's shop, a merchant's clerk by the look of him, carrying himself with the awkward stiffness of someone unaccustomed to custom fittings. The door closed, the street remained quiet, and the gaslight in the shop burned on. Hours passed. No one emerged. Just before dawn, Crane stepped out alone, locking the door behind him, the shape of a bulging sack gripped tightly in his hand. Lenz's heart quickened, though he told himself he could be mistaken, that the clerk might have left unseen. Yet when he discreetly visited the merchant's offices the following day, the man was absent, his desk cleared. That was when Lenz understood he was looking at something far darker than trade deceit. And if his suspicions were right, proof would not come from gossip. It would come from stepping through that shop door himself, into whatever lay behind the curtain. Lenz knew a direct accusation would do nothing. Without proof, it would only serve to warn Crane that someone was watching. If Crane suspected him, the shop's door would close forever, and whatever secrets hung behind that curtain would vanish with him. No, Lenz would need to move as a customer, one seeking a garment that only Crane could make. He spent days rehearsing his approach, considering what might entice a man so private to take him beyond the front room. The answer came in the form of a commission that would be impossible to fulfill. Without access to the back, a bespoke hunting coat, lined in a rare, soft material known as Persian lamb. A textile lens claimed to have in limited supply, but needing Crane's skill to assemble. The fabric was a fiction, but the lure was bait enough. On a grey afternoon thick with coal smoke, Lens entered the shop, feigning the cautious curiosity of a man seeking perfection. Crane's eyes flicked over him without recognition at first, then sharpened in faint acknowledgement from their brief exchange at the gathering weeks before. The tailor listened in silence as Lens described the project, his gaze drifting not to the non-existent fabric, but to Lens himself, as if taking his measure in more ways than one. After a long pause, Crane agreed to a private fitting the next evening. The words were few, but they carried the weight of a door being quietly unlocked. When Lens left the shop, his pulse was pounding. That night, he prepared a small revolver, concealing it beneath his overcoat, and sewed a thin steel plate into the lining over his chest, a precaution against the possibility that his suspicions were not only right, but that he might not walk out alive. He told no one where he was going, not even the apprentice who kept his own shop. The following evening, as the gas lamps burned low and the streets emptied, Lens approached Crane's door. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly with oil and something metallic. Crane gestured for him to step behind the curtain. Lens hesitated for the briefest moment, his hand brushing the revolver's grip beneath his coat, before crossing into the dim, silent space beyond, where the hooks hung in shadow and something pale shifted just out of sight. The backroom was smaller than Lens expected, but its closeness only magnified the sense of being shut away from the world. The air was damp and faintly warm, thick with a smell that was not fabric at all, but something closer to tanned leather and faintly sweet decay. Against the far wall, 3 garments hung from the hooks, long overcoats, each draped with a perfection that suggested pride in their creation. But it was the linings that froze Lens in place. The light caught them in such a way that the surface shimmered with a texture no mill could produce. Fine ridges, delicate swirls, and in one, the faintest impression of what could only be pores. Crane moved past him silently, retrieving his shears from the workbench, the blades glinting in the low light. He began to speak, his voice soft, as though discussing a common commission. "Persian lamb is rare," he said, "but not as rare as a perfect match." Lens's eyes darted to the workbench. No bolts of cloth, no spools of thread, only a large basin, its water tinted a dull pinkish hue, and strips of something pale stretched taut on a wooden frame, glistening under the lamplight. He understood then, with a cold clarity, that he was standing in a room built not for tailoring, but for the transformation of flesh into something to be worn. His hand shifted toward the revolver hidden beneath his coat, but Crane's gaze flicked toward the movement, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. "Your shoulders," he murmured, stepping closer, "are well balanced. Ideal for a winter cut." Lens forced a steady tone into his voice, muttering about needing to fetch the promised fabric, but Crane did not move aside. Instead, he placed the shears gently on the bench and closed the gap between them, his presence filling the space like a slow, advancing tide. The lamplight caught in Crane's eyes, and for the first time, Lens saw not the artisan, but the predator, the man who measured life not in years, but in yards of usable material. Behind them, one of the hanging coats swayed slightly, though no breeze passed through the room. The motion was enough to make Lens's pulse surge. If he was to leave alive, it would have to be now, before Crane decided the measuring was over. Lens's fingers brushed the revolver's grip, the weight of it an anchor against the growing sense that the walls were drawing inward. Crane stood just feet away, his posture relaxed, but his eyes fixed with a precision that stripped away any pretense of civility. The room was too quiet. Even the faint ticking of a clock in the front had fallen away. Lens shifted his stance, angling his body toward the curtain, as though preparing to retrieve the imaginary fabric. Crane took a single step sideways, casually positioning himself between Lenz and the exit. It was the kind of movement a man might make without thought, except there was nothing unthinking about it. The lamplight glinted off the shears still resting on the workbench, and for a brief, searing moment, Lenz imagined the steel slipping beneath his ribs. His pulse hammered in his ears, but his voice came out steady, almost bored, as he remarked on the impressive work hanging on the hooks. Crane tilted his head slightly, studying him like a specimen. "You recognize quality when you see it," he said quietly. Lenz took a slow step forward, feigning interest in the nearest coat. The lining caught the light again, revealing details that would haunt him. Tiny creases where joints had once bent, a faint seam that could only have been a scar. His stomach lurched, but his expression did not falter. He extended one hand as if to examine the stitching, then turned sharply, his other hand snapping the revolver free in a single, practiced motion. Crane's eyes narrowed, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, slowly, deliberately, like a man who had been expecting this moment all along. "Careful," he murmured. "Tools like that are meant for killing." Lenz kept the barrel trained on him, the space between them heavy with the possibility of a single, irrevocable act. But Crane didn't move. He didn't lunge. He didn't plead. He simply stood there, the silence stretching until it seemed to have weight, as if the very air would collapse under it. Somewhere outside, a carriage wheel clattered over cobblestones, the sound distant and fleeting. When it faded, only the two of them remained, locked, in a stillness that felt like the breath before a blade falls. And in that breath, Lenz knew, Crane was waiting for him to choose. The air between them seemed to thicken, each second stretching longer than the last. Lenz's arm began to ache from holding the revolver steady, but lowering it was not an option. He could see it in Crane's eyes. The moment he faltered, the tailor would close the distance with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done it before. Crane's gaze didn't flicker to the weapon. It remained locked on Lenz's face, studying every twitch, every bead of sweat. "You came here for proof," Crane said at last, his voice low, almost conversational. "But proof has a price." Lenz's mind raced. Shooting him outright would end the threat, but it would also strand him in a locked backroom with no one to vouch for why he was there, and a scene too gruesome for the police to believe without damning him in the process. He took a slow step toward the curtain, keeping the revolver aimed squarely at Crane's chest. Crane didn't follow, but his hand shifted ever so slightly toward the shears on the bench. Lenz's thumb drew back the hammer with a sharp metallic click, freezing that hand mid-motion. For the first time, Crane's expression faltered, not into fear but into something colder. Calculation. "You won't make it to the street," he said simply, and it didn't sound like a threat so much as a fact. Lenz's heart pounded, but he pressed forward, each step bringing him closer to the curtain and the faint promise of air that didn't reek of oil and flesh. The fabric was just within reach when a noise from the far wall snapped his attention, a slow, deliberate creak of one of the hooks, as if something heavy had just shifted. His eyes flicked toward it, and in that fraction of a second, Crane moved. The shears clattered to the floor as his hand closed around something hidden behind the workbench, a glint of steel unlike any tailoring tool. Lenz swung the revolver toward him, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Crane's momentum was already carrying him forward, silent as a shadow, his eyes alight with the cold satisfaction of a predator, certain that the hunt had just turned. The first movement was a blur, Crane lunging low, the steel in his hand flashing in the lamplight. Lenz fired, the shot deafening in the tight space, the recoil jarring his arm. The bullet tore into Crane's shoulder, spinning him sideways, but not stopping him. He moved with the grim determination of a wounded animal, his free hand latching onto Lenz's coat, yanking him off balance. They slammed against the workbench, the basin tipping and spilling its pink-stained water across the floor. The smell hit Lenz like a blow, metallic and rotten, as though the room itself exhaled its secrets. Crane's blade, a narrow, curved skiving knife meant for stripping flesh, darted toward Lenz's ribs. Lenz twisted, the edge catching the steel plate sewn into his lining with a sharp scrape. Pain flared along his side where the tip grazed flesh, but the plate had done its job. They grappled. The revolver knocked Rom Lenz's hand, skidding under the bench. Crane's strength was shocking, his injured arm barely slowing the precision of his movements. Lenz managed to drive his elbow into Crane's jaw, forcing a half-step of space between them. His eyes darted to the revolver, but Crane followed his gaze and kicked it further into the shadows. The coats on the hooks swayed violently now, one of them slipping free and collapsing onto the wet floor with a sound far too heavy for cloth. It landed half open, the lining exposed, pale, ridged, and unmistakably human. The sight jolted Lenz's resolve. He seized a pair of heavy tailoring shears from the bench, turning them into a makeshift weapon. Crane's lips curled in a humorless smile, as if the irony amused him. They circled each other in the narrow space, water pooling around their boots, the room's only exit blocked by Crane's looming figure. Outside, the city went on oblivious, its noise distant and muffled, as if they were deep underwater. Lenz feinted left, then lunged, driving the shears toward Crane's wounded side. The blade bit into fabric, met resistance, then slid free, leaving a dark stain blooming across the herringbone wool. Crane staggered, but his grip on the knife didn't loosen. Instead, he stepped in again, his voice a low rasp in the space between them. "Now I know your measure." And then he came forward. The backroom had shrunk to the size of a coffin, every inch of air charged with the heat of struggle and the smell of wet wool and iron. Crane's wounded shoulder bled steadily, the dark patch spreading across the herringbone, but his movements were still controlled, deliberate, as if every strike of the knife were part of some precise, unseen pattern. Lenz's arms burned from the effort of parrying with the shears, each metallic clang echoing in his skull. The water from the overturned basin slicked the floor, making every step a gamble. Twice he nearly lost his footing, each time feeling the rush of steel miss him by a hair. Crane advanced with a predator's patience, forcing Lenz into the corner where the wall met the heavy curtain. Beyond that curtain was the street, the noise, the air, freedom, but the space between felt like a chasm he might never cross. Lenz's mind narrowed to one thought: end it now, or end here. He feinted toward Crane's injured side, drawing the tailor's knife arm just wide enough to expose his ribs. Then, with a sharp pivot, he drove the points of the shears forward with all the strength left in his body. The steel met resistance, then broke through, the sound more muted than he expected, followed by a sudden collapse of weight against him. Crane's breath left in a slow, rattling exhale, warm against Lenz's neck. For a moment, neither man moved, the only sound the drip of water from the overturned basin. Then Crane's grip on the knife loosened, the blade clattering to the floor, and he slid down to his knees, the fabric of his coat darkening rapidly. Lenz stumbled back, the shears still in his hands, his chest heaving. But before relief could take hold, Crane's head lifted, and his eyes, still clear, still cold, locked onto him. Blood pooled at his knees, but his voice came steady, almost conversational. "Do you think it ends with me?" His mouth curved into the faintest smile, as if some private victory had just been won. Then, with a sudden motion that belied his weakening body, Crane reached behind him toward the workbench, his fingers brushing against something Lenz couldn't see. Lenz's instincts screamed to close the distance, to knock Crane's hand away before it found whatever weapon lay hidden behind the bench. But the hesitation of exhaustion slowed him, and in that brief pause, Crane's fingers closed around a small, leather-bound book. Not a weapon, at least not in the obvious sense. He clutched it to his chest with surprising strength, smearing its cover with blood. "You don't understand," Crane rasped, his eyes narrowing as if savoring the moment. "This is the measure of every man I've ever cut." Lenz could see the edges of thick, stained pages, their corners curling with age and dampness. Even from a distance, the faint odor that clung to the book told him it had been kept too close to the same materials that lined Crane's coats. Names, Crane whispered. Dates. Patterns. You think I chose at random? No. No, every stitch belongs to a place in the whole. His words faltered into a cough, dark spittle marking his chin, but his grip never loosened. Lenz stepped forward cautiously, the shears raised, his gaze fixed on the book. A record like that could end Crane forever in the eyes of the city, could tie him to every disappearance the police had dismissed. But Crane's smile deepened, teeth red in the lamplight. If you take it, you take my place, he said softly, as though passing on a curse rather than an artifact. The phrase lodged in Lenz's mind with a weight he couldn't shake. He lunged, wrenching the book free, the leather slick in his hands. Crane didn't fight him. Instead, he sagged back against the bench, his eyes never leaving Lenz's. In the dim light, Lenz saw that some of the pages were marked not only with names, but with measurements, shoulder widths, arm lengths, chest circumferences, each written in an exacting, practiced hand. And among them, toward the back, was a fresh entry. His own name, written neatly, as if Crane had known from the moment they met that this night would come. Lenz's throat tightened. Crane's breathing slowed, each inhale rattling, each exhale softer. It doesn't end here, he murmured again, almost gently. Then his eyes rolled toward the ceiling, and the room fell into a silence that felt too deliberate, too prepared, like the pause between movements in a performance that was not yet finished. Lenz stood over Crane's slumped body, the leather-bound book heavy in his hand, its pages seeming to warm against his palm as though it held a pulse of its own. The smell of the back room clung to him, oil, wool, and the faint sweetness of decay, making each breath feel heavier. He glanced at the curtain that separated him from the street, the only barrier between him and the night air, and his legs urged him forward. Each step squelched on the wet floor, the sound too loud in the unnatural quiet. He pulled the curtain aside, the faint glow of the gas lamp spilling across the shop's empty front. For the first time since stepping inside, he allowed himself the thought that he might live through this night. But as he crossed toward the door, something caught his eye. Movement in the glass of the shop window. At first, he thought it was a trick of the lamplight outside, but then the shape shifted, resolving into the silhouette of a man standing just beyond the pane, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. Lenz froze, the book clutched tighter against his chest. The figure didn't move, didn't knock, didn't call out. He simply stood there, as if waiting. A cold ripple passed through Lenz when he realized the stance was familiar, deliberate, like a tailor assessing a client before a fitting. He turned the lock slowly, but before he could decide whether to open the door or retreat, a second shape emerged from the shadows across the street. Then another. 3 men now, each in long coats, their collars turned high, their positions perfectly spaced, as if rehearsed. None of them approached, but all of them stared toward the shop, still and patient. Lenz's mind flashed to Crane's words, "You take my place," and the implication that this was never the work of one man alone. His grip tightened on the shears, still in his other hand, though he knew they'd be useless if these men moved as Crane had. Behind him, the curtain swayed faintly, as though the back room were breathing. The street was silent, but for the faint hiss of the gas lamps, and in that silence, one of the men outside raised a gloved hand, not in greeting, but in a slow, precise motion that looked very much like the start of a measurement. Lenz's breath clouded faintly in the cold air leaking through the doorframe, his pulse matching the faint hiss of the gas lamps outside. The 3 figures hadn't moved closer, but their stillness was worse than an advance. It suggested a patience that could outlast him, a certainty that he would make the wrong choice. The book in his arm felt heavier by the second, its edges pressing into his ribs like a reminder of what he'd taken. He considered slipping back into the back room, but the thought of standing in that suffocating space with Crane's body and whatever else might still be hanging on those hooks was unbearable. He tried to calculate the distance to the nearest alley, wondering if the men would follow at a run or simply close in at a measured pace, like hunters who already knew their quarry was cornered. His fingers hovered over the door's latch, then froze when the figure closest to the window tilted his head, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, as if listening for something. That was when Lenz realized the sound of dripping water from the back room had stopped. The silence behind him deepened, carrying a weight that pulled at his attention. Slowly, he turned his head, his eyes drawn toward the curtain. It swayed again, though no draught touched it, and beneath the hem, a shadow passed, low and deliberate. His throat tightened. Crane had been motionless when he left the back room. Lifeless, or so he thought, but the possibility that he was no longer alone back there sank into him like ice. Outside, one of the men shifted his stance, stepping to the side, just enough to block the mouth of the alley Lenz had been eyeing. The third figure adjusted his coat collar, revealing the faint glint of something metallic in his hand. Lenz's grip on the shears tightened, his mind a war between the urge to burst into the street and the fear of what might be waiting on both sides of the glass. The choice had to be made now. He set his jaw, moved toward the latch, and from behind the curtain came the unmistakable sound of something heavy brushing against the hooks, followed by a slow, deliberate exhale. The sound from behind the curtain was enough to splinter Lenz's focus, pulling his attention away from the figures outside just long enough for the nearest one to take a slow, measured step toward the door. The floorboards beneath Lenz creaked as he turned fully toward the back room, the shears angled in his grip. His pulse was a hammer in his ears, his body torn between charging into the street and facing whatever was now breathing in the shadows behind that swaying fabric. Another exhale drifted out, wet and rattling, followed by the faint scrape of something against the floor, too heavy to be a hand, too uneven to be footsteps. Lenz's stomach tightened as the curtain bulged slightly inward, as if something was leaning against it. Outside, the second man moved into position at the far corner of the window, effectively closing off any clear escape to the left. The third figure, still half hidden in the street's shadows, lifted a hand and tapped two fingers slowly against his coat sleeve, a gesture so deliberate that Lenz felt the heat rise in his neck. It wasn't a signal to the others. It was a measurement. His mind flashed to the book still tucked under his arm, the pages within that held names and numbers, and the fresh one that bore his own. The realization struck like cold iron. They weren't here to avenge Crane. They were here to continue his work. The curtain rippled again, and this time a shadow spilled into view along the floor, a narrow, elongated shape dragging behind it something dark and glistening. Lenz took a half step back, his shoulder nearly brushing the front door. The lock was under his hand now. He could throw it open and make a run for it, but the street beyond no longer looked like freedom. The two nearest men stood with an unnatural stillness, their eyes fixed on him through the glass, while the third began to move forward, slow enough to make each second heavier than the last. Behind the curtain came a sudden, sharp sound, the snap of a hook breaking free from the ceiling. The fabric swelled outward as if pushed by something that no longer had to hang. Lenz's fingers closed around the latch, his other hand raised with the shears, and for one breathless instant he realized that no matter which way he moved, something was already waiting. The latch clicked beneath Lenz's hand at the exact moment the curtain tore open. A shape burst through, low, fast and dripping, the smell of oil and blood rushing ahead of it. Lenz stumbled back, catching only flashes. A shoulder hunched at an unnatural angle, the gleam of something curved clutched tight in one pale hand. His instincts dragged the shears upward just in time to deflect a slicing blow meant for his neck. The impact jarred his wrist, sent a line of pain up his arm. Behind the thing, whether it was Crane himself or some other shadow that had been waiting, he saw the hooks swinging wildly. One of them snapped clean from the ceiling, its length of chain clattering on the wet floor. The front door slammed inward against his back, the force nearly knocking him forward. One of the men from outside had entered, his gloved hand clamping onto Lenz's shoulder with a strength that cut through the thick fabric of his coat. Lenz twisted, driving the shears backward in a blind thrust. The man grunted, releasing his grip, but another silhouette filled the doorway instantly. The second figure moved with unnerving precision, sidestepping Lens's desperate swing and grabbing for the book under his arm. The leather bit into his ribs as he wrenched away, the pages bending but not breaking. From the back room came a wet shuffle of footsteps, faster now, closing the distance. Lens's boot skidded on the slick floor, and in the half-second it took to recover, the third man from outside appeared in the doorway, blocking the only visible exit. Trapped between them and whatever was advancing from behind, Lens's mind snapped to the only advantage he had, the revolver under the bench. He lunged sideways, feeling a hand swipe at his collar, but the slippery board sent him crashing against the workbench instead. His palm slapped down in a puddle of cold water, and he scrambled toward the shadows beneath, fingers sweeping for the weapon. A boot heel slammed down on his forearm, pinning it to the floor. Above him, the man leaned close enough for Lens to see the faint, deliberate smile under the brim of his hat. From behind, the wet sound of bare feet on wood drew closer, and a single drop of something warm landed on the back of Lens's neck. The boot on Lens's arm ground harder, forcing a sharp cry from his throat as his fingers strained toward the revolver's cold steel. The man above him didn't speak, didn't even breathe heavily. He simply applied pressure with the calculated control of someone who had done this before. From behind came the sound of that slow, wet approach, each step deliberate, the boards creaking as if under something heavier than a man. Lens twisted his head just enough to see the pale figure advancing from the back room, its left arm hanging useless while the right clutched the skiving knife. Whether it was Crane or some half-living remnant, the eyes glinted with the same cold intent. Panic sharpened Lens's resolve. With his free hand, he slashed upward with the shears, the blade catching the edge of the man's boot. Leather split, and the sudden give was enough to wrench his arm free. He lunged forward, snatching the revolver from the shadows just as the pale figure closed the last step. The muzzle came up in one trembling arc, the barrel aligning with the glistening face. But before he could fire, another hand shot in from the side, seizing his wrist. The second man from the doorway had moved in, his grip like iron, twisting the gun toward the floor. The shot went off with a deafening crack, the bullet sparking off the boards and filling the room with smoke. In the chaos, the pale figure surged forward, and Lens felt the knife's edge catch his coat, slicing through the outer fabric and biting just enough into the steel plate beneath to send a shockwave of pain through his ribs. He drove his shoulder hard into the attacker, forcing a moment's space, the revolver still locked in the other man's grip. The book under his arm shifted, nearly slipping free, and all three of them seemed to notice at once. The men's movements quickened, their measured precision giving way to a sudden, coordinated violence. Each strike aimed not to kill him, but to pry the book from his grasp. The pale figure lunged again, mouth opening in a wet, ragged breath, and Lens realized with a sick certainty that they weren't trying to stop him from leaving. They were trying to keep the record intact, so it could be carried on. His thumb strained against the revolver's hammer, the barrel inches from the nearest face, when the front window shattered inward in a spray of glass. The explosion of glass ripped through the shop like a gunshot, the shards catching the lamplight as they rained across the floor. All heads turned, just for a heartbeat, but it was enough to fracture the tight choreography that had kept Lens pinned. A dark shape rolled through the jagged opening, landing in a crouch among the splinters. Whoever it was moved fast, sweeping the legs from one of the men with a brutal efficiency that sent him crashing into the front counter. The second man released Lens's wrist to intercept the newcomer, and in that breath of freedom, Lens yanked the revolver back into his control. He swung it toward the pale figure, but it had already melted into the shadows of the back room, its wet footsteps retreating with unnatural quiet. The newcomer, dressed in a long, heavy coat dusted with frost, moved with the controlled violence of someone who knew exactly where to strike. He didn't look at Lens, didn't speak, just drove his elbow into the second man's ribs before shoving him into the display window frame with enough force to rattle the glass still clinging to its edges. The third figure from outside stepped over the threshold, advancing steadily, his eyes locked on the book under Lens's arm. The stranger glanced at the book too, and for the briefest instant, Lens caught something in his gaze. Not curiosity, but recognition. The revolver was up again, the barrel tracking between the third man and the stranger, both of whom now stood equidistant from him, the tension straining like a rope ready to snap. Somewhere behind him, deep in the back room, the sound of a hook creaking against its chain echoed faintly, followed by a single, deliberate click, like a lock being turned. Lens's skin prickled. If the pale figure wasn't gone, then it was waiting for a moment like this. The stranger took a slow step toward him, one hand slightly extended, not in threat, but in request. "Give it to me," he said, his voice low but steady. The third man's hand twitched toward his coat pocket. Lens's thumb pulled the revolver's hammer back until it locked. In front of him, two men. Behind him, something worse. The choice pressed in like the walls themselves, and he knew whichever way he turned, there would be no turning back. Lens's mind split the world into fractions of a second, each one heavier than the last. The stranger's hand remained steady, palm open in silent demand, while the third man's eyes tightened into something colder, his fingers curling toward the inside of his coat. Behind Lens, the sound from the backroom deepened, wet, dragging, and closer than before. The air smelled thicker now, as though the heat from that hidden space had begun to seep forward, carrying with it the faint tang of something preserved too long. He tightened his grip on the revolver and made his choice. With a sharp pivot, he leveled the barrel at the third man by the door and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the shop, sending the man staggering backward into the glass frame, his coat flaring open just enough to reveal a long, hooked blade strapped inside. The stranger moved instantly, lunging past Lens toward the fallen man, driving a boot down to keep him from regaining his feet. But the gunshot had cost Lens his focus, long enough for the pale figure to emerge from the curtain's edge. It came low and fast, its wounded arm useless, but its good one clutching the skiving knife with murderous intent. Lens twisted, firing again, the shot tearing into the shoulder with a spray that painted the wall, but still it advanced, the force of its steps rattling the hooks above. The stranger shouted something Lens didn't catch, his voice drowned beneath the crash of a display shelf toppling in the struggle. The book nearly slipped from Lens's arm as the pale figure's free hand seized his coat, the fingers locking like iron. They spun together, slamming into the counter hard enough to send wooden drawers spilling open, spools of dark thread unraveling across the floor like veins. Somewhere in the chaos, the third man wrenched free of the stranger's hold, his movements slower but still deliberate, his eyes never leaving the book. Lens's revolver clicked dry, the last bullet spent. The pale figure's breath washed over his face, foul and warm, and the knife lifted for a killing thrust. Then, from the corner of the shop, the stranger's hand flashed, hurling something small and metallic through the air. It struck the figure square in the temple with a sickening crack, but whether it would fall or rise angrier than before, Lens had no time to see. The metallic crack sent the pale figure staggering sideways, its grip loosening just enough for Lens to wrench himself free. It didn't fall, not completely. Its legs buckled in an unnatural way, like a marionette whose strings had been cut unevenly, and it slumped against the counter, knife still clutched tight. Lens backed away, breathing hard, the book jammed under his arm, his empty revolver hanging useless in his other hand. The stranger crossed the floor in 2 quick strides, his coat sweeping behind him, and planted himself between Lens and the swaying figure. "Move!" he barked, not at Lens, but toward the third man, who was already circling wide, his focus locked on the leather-bound volume. For a moment, it was a perfect triangle, Lens holding the book, the stranger blocking the pale figure, and the third man cutting off the path to the door. The air hummed with tension, broken only by the faint rattle of the hooks above, as though the entire room were holding its breath. Then the pale figure straightened with a slow, jerking motion, its head tilting toward Lens with a sickening awareness. Blood slicked its temple where the metal had struck, but its eyes, dark, glassy, and unblinking, locked on the book as though nothing else in the world existed. The third man lunged, and Lens reacted without thought, swinging the revolver like a club. It connected with the man's jaw, sending him reeling, but not before his fingers hooked the edge of the book's cover. Pages tore with a sound far too loud in the small space, a strip of paper dangling between them. The stranger cursed under his breath and shoved Lenz hard toward the shattered window. "Go!" he snapped, his tone more command than plea. Lenz hesitated, his eyes darting between the street outside, empty now but for shadows, and the nightmare still advancing from the back room. The pale figure's knife arm rose, slow but unwavering, while the third man recovered his footing, his hand diving inside his coat for the hooked blade Lenz had glimpsed earlier. The stranger stepped forward to intercept them both, but as he did, the book slipped from Lenz's grip, tumbling toward the wet floor. All three of them saw it fall at once, and for the briefest instant, the fight stopped, each man gauging who would reach it first. The book hit the wet floor with a heavy, damp thud, its pages fanning out just enough to reveal the dark, inked names within. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the room exploded into motion. The third man lunged low, his hooked blade flashing as he dove for the prize. The stranger pivoted hard, his coat flaring, and brought his boot down toward the man's wrist with bone-cracking force. The pale figure surged forward as well, its movements stuttering yet swift, the knife in its grip gleaming with a greasy sheen under the lamplight. Lenz dropped to one knee, reaching for the book, his fingers brushing the slick leather, only to have the stranger shove him sideways with brutal efficiency. "Out!" the man barked again, his voice sharp with urgency. Lenz rolled across the wet boards, his shoulder striking the base of the display counter, the impact rattling the few unbroken panes of glass. The third man snarled as he twisted away from the stranger's boot, his other hand swiping the book off the floor. Pages bent and tore under the sudden pressure, one sheet ripping clean away and fluttering into the shallow puddle. The pale figure's knife lashed out, catching the edge of the stranger's sleeve, slicing through cloth but missing flesh. The stranger countered with a short, vicious strike to its jaw, sending it staggering back against the workbench, but it didn't drop the knife. Lenz scrambled to his feet, eyes locked on the torn page drifting in the water. He snatched it up before it could soak through, his gaze catching on the writing. Names and measurements he didn't recognize, until his eyes landed on the last entry. It was fresh, the ink still dark and clean. Beside it was not his name, but one that froze the breath in his chest. August Lentz, replacement. The implication cut deeper than any blade in the room. Behind him, the stranger and the third man grappled for the book, their boots sending ripples across the shallow puddle as the pale figure crept toward them both, knife poised. Lenz clutched the single torn page in his hand, realizing it might be the only fragment that could damn them all, or mark him forever. Then the stranger was suddenly knocked off balance, the book sliding free again and skidding across the floor, this time straight toward Lenz. The book slid across the wet boards like it had been aimed for him, its weight seeming to pull the room's focus with it. Lenz bent instinctively, his fingers curling around the slick leather, the torn page still clutched in his other hand. The noise of the struggle behind him dulled for a heartbeat, as if the moment had wrapped itself in a strange, expectant silence. Crane's dying words echoed in his head. "You take my place." And for the first time, they didn't feel like a threat, but a condition. The book's surface was warm, almost pulsing, and the faint scent rising from it carried the same sweet rot that lingered in the back room. Behind him, the stranger broke free of the third man's grip and surged toward Lenz, one hand outstretched. "Don't open it," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut through the chaos. But Lenz's thumb had already hooked under the cover, his curiosity battling the primal urge to flee. The pale figure's reflection appeared in the water at his feet, its warped outline bending around his own, a reminder that every second he hesitated brought it closer. He glanced toward the shattered window. The street beyond was empty again, the cold air rolling in like an invitation. If he took the book and ran, he could vanish into that darkness, find the police, and put an end to all of this. But deep down, he knew what they would see. Not a rescuer, but a man clutching a blood-stained ledger filled with the names of the missing. His own name already written. The stranger was almost on him now, his boots splashing through the puddles, his expression unreadable but urgent. "It's not yours," he said, each word measured, deliberate. The third man, bleeding but not beaten, lunged again from the side, his hand snatching at the book's corner. Lenz twisted, ripping it away, the motion tearing another page loose. It fluttered upward between them, and all three pairs of eyes followed its slow, spiraling descent until it landed on the wet floor face up, revealing a fresh, uninked space beneath the last name, a blank line waiting to be filled. The pale figure stepped into the circle of light, knife raised, its shadow spilling over the empty line as if to claim it. Lenz's breath felt heavier than the cold air pouring through the shattered window, each inhale dragging against the knot in his chest. The book's weight had shifted in his grip, as if the torn and empty page within it were pulling at him, urging him to look again. He didn't. The pale figure's shadow stretched across the blank space like a signature already written in darkness. The stranger moved fast, stepping between Lenz and the knife, his coat brushing the edge of the page. "Go!" he shouted without looking back, his voice cracking with the strain of holding two enemies at bay. The third man circled to Lenz's right, cutting off the direct path to the street. Every move was calculated, not to kill him outright, but to funnel him, to herd him toward the inevitable. He clutched the torn page tighter in one hand, the book in the other, the edges wet and curling. Behind the curtain, a faint metallic groan rose, like a hook taking on weight, and the memory of Crane's backroom swelled in his mind, how the air there had felt heavier, thicker, as though saturated with years of captured breath. He stepped toward the window, testing the gap, but the third man shifted again, his hand dipping into his coat where the glint of steel waited. "If you leave with it," he said flatly, "you carry it forward." Lenz didn't ask what it was. He already knew. His name on the last line wouldn't just be a record, it would be a claim, a binding. The stranger shoved the pale figure back with a violent twist, buying Lenz another second. That was all it was, a second, enough to lunge for the window, boots skidding on the wet boards. The cold night air kissed his face just as a hand clamped around his ankle. He twisted, kicking hard, the heel of his boot connecting with something soft. The grip loosened, and he threw himself halfway through the jagged frame, shards catching at his coat and drawing thin lines of heat across his ribs. Then the book was yanked in the opposite direction, the force nearly dislocating his shoulder. He looked back, and the pale figure had one hand locked on the ledger, the knife still glistening in the other, its eyes fixed not on him, but on the space in the book that waited to be filled. The glass bit into Lenz's palms as he dragged himself the rest of the way through the window, the bitter air slamming into his lungs like a wall. His boots crunched on the icy cobblestones outside, but the victory of reaching open ground lasted only a heartbeat. The pale figure came through after him, shoving its gaunt frame through the jagged frame with a speed that belied its wounds. The book was still clutched in both their hands, the leather stretching between them, wet with street slush and blood. Lenz twisted, trying to wrench it free, but the figure's grip was unbreakable, its knife hand rising in a blur. The stranger vaulted through the window next, hitting the street with a roll and coming up between them, his arm slamming against the pale figure's wrist hard enough to jar the blade loose. It clattered onto the stones, spinning once before sliding toward a gutter. The third man emerged from the shop door, stepping into the dim spill of a gas lamp, his eyes scanning the empty street as if ensuring no witnesses would intrude. Snow fell in thin, wind-driven streaks, muffling sound and narrowing the world to the fight. Lenz's boot slipped on the icy stones, the book nearly tearing from his grasp as the pale figure surged forward again, its face inches from his, breath steaming in the cold. The stranger grabbed the figure by the collar, hauling it back just enough for Lenz to pivot and slam his shoulder into it, breaking the stalemate. For a fleeting moment, the book was his alone again. The third man began to close the distance, his gloved hands empty, but his stance suggesting he didn't need a weapon to end this. From somewhere deep in the alley behind them came the faint clink of metal, a sound too deliberate to be wind or falling ice. The stranger's eyes flicked toward it, his face tightening. "We're not alone," he muttered. Lenz didn't have time to ask. The pale figure lunged once more, the two of them slamming into the side of a lamppost hard enough to make the light shudder. The impact knocked the breath from his chest, and his fingers faltered on the slick leather. The book slipped halfway free, the torn page still jammed between its covers, when a shadow detached from the alley wall and began walking toward them. Its stride measured, its hands hidden in the folds of a long, dark coat. The shadowed figure moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who already knew how the night would end. Each step was crisp on the frozen cobblestones, the faint crunch of ice underfoot cutting through the muffled sounds of the struggle. Lens's grip on the book tightened, his eyes locked on the newcomer's face as it came into the dim circle of lamplight. A man older than Crane, with sharp, hawk-like features and a mouth set in a line that looked carved from stone. His eyes, however, were fixed on the ledger, not on Lens. "Enough," the man said, his voice carrying the weight of command. The pale figure froze mid-lunge, its body twitching with the effort of restraint as if compelled by something deeper than fear. Even the third man, now only a few steps away, halted in place, his gaze shifting to the older figure with something approaching deference. The stranger who had helped Lens took a cautious step back, his breath ghosting in the frigid air, but he didn't lower his stance. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, as though speaking to an equal, or to someone worse. The older man ignored him, his gaze never wavering from the book. "It belongs with us," he said, not as a plea, but as a statement of fact. Lens's heart hammered against his ribs. The way the others reacted made it clear. This man was above Crane, above all of them. If the ledger left with him, it would vanish into whatever network had created the Tailor's place in the first place. The older man took one slow step closer, his coat shifting just enough to reveal the edge of something metallic in the inner pocket, a glint that could have been a weapon, or a tool meant for a very different purpose. "You don't understand what you're holding," he said, "and you don't want to." The snow hissed softly as it struck the hot lamplight, the silence stretching into something unbearable. Lens glanced at the stranger, but his expression gave nothing away. The pale figure's head tilted in a slow, jerking motion, its eyes on the older man as though awaiting permission. The older man extended one gloved hand toward Lens, palm open, fingers curling once in a beckoning gesture. "Give it," he said. And in that moment, Lens realized that every set of eyes on that street, living or otherwise, was waiting for his answer. The older man's hand hung in the cold air like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Snow clung to the cuff of his coat, the faintest tremor visible in the lamplight, but it wasn't weakness. It was the barely contained precision of someone who acted only when sure of the outcome. Lens's breath came in short bursts, the ledger's weight suddenly unbearable in his grip. The stranger who had fought beside him remained silent, his eyes fixed on the older man, as though gauging not what he might do, but when. Behind them, the pale figure shifted its stance, each movement a grotesque parody of readiness, the knife now dangling loosely at its side, but still within striking range. The third man moved no closer, but the subtle tightening of his shoulders spoke of coiled violence. Lens's mind raced. Handing over the ledger might save his life in the moment, but it would bury every chance of exposing what Crane, and whatever this was, had been part of. Worse, the blank line in the book's final page might yet hold his name, and surrendering it could seal a fate he wouldn't see coming. The older man's voice cut through the snow-muted street again, low and calm. "You've already touched it. That means you've already begun." The words coiled in Lens's chest like smoke, half threat, half prophecy. He tightened his hold on the torn page in his other hand, feeling the rough texture under his fingertips. The stranger's eyes flicked to it, and for the briefest instant, his expression shifted. Alarm, maybe even warning, but it was gone before Lens could be sure. "This is your last chance," the older man said, his open hand now curling slowly into a fist. The pale figure's head tilted sharply at the motion, like a predator catching a scent. The snow seemed to fall heavier, muffling the city beyond, until there was only the circle of lamplight, the ring of figures around him, and the choice tightening like a noose. Lens's pulse thudded in his ears. If he ran, they'd follow. If he fought, They'd swarm. If he gave it over, they'd own him in ways that had nothing to do with survival. His thumb shifted against the ledger's cover, his jaw set, just as the older man gave the smallest nod. And all at once, everyone moved. The nod was like a spark in dry tinder, instant, unstoppable. The pale figure lunged first, its jerking gait giving way to startling speed, knife flashing upward in a perfect arc toward Lens's throat. The third man came in from the left, his gloved hand snapping out for the ledger, while the older man remained perfectly still, watching the violence unfold like a conductor overseeing an orchestra. The stranger intercepted the third man with a hard shoulder, driving him back into the lamppost, the hollow clang echoing down the empty street. Lens pivoted away from the pale figure's blade, feeling it slice through the air close enough to raise the hairs along his neck. The leather of the book was slick in his grip now, blood, snow, and street grit combining into something treacherously slippery. He shoved the torn page into his coat pocket, freeing his other hand to strike. The stranger shouted something, short, sharp, but it was lost in the clash of boots on ice and the scrape of steel. The pale figure's knife hand came down again, and Lentz caught it with both hands, the force of the blow driving him back against the wall of the building. The impact rattled the ledger from his grasp. It hit the ground in a spray of slush and skidded toward the older man's waiting feet. For the first time, the man moved. He stooped with deliberate calm, his gloved hand closing over the book as though it had never been out of his possession. The pale figure froze mid-strike. The third man ceased his struggle with the stranger, both of them still, like dogs called to heel. The older man straightened, brushing a fleck of snow from the ledger's cover, his eyes locking on Lentz with something almost like pity. "It's finished," he said softly, though the words carried in the cold air. But Lentz's hand was already in his coat pocket, gripping the torn page, his thumb smearing the damp ink of the names. The stranger's eyes darted to it, then back to Lentz, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. The older man took a step forward, the pale figure shadowing him, the third man moving to flank. Snow swirled between them, the lamplight dimming under the thickening fall. "Give it," the older man repeated, extending his hand for the page. Lentz drew it out slowly, the cold tightening around his chest. Then, without a word, he tore it clean in half. The sound of paper ripping was louder than it should have been, sharp as a pistol crack in the snow-thickened air. For the first time all night, the older man's expression changed. No longer carved from stone, but cracking just enough to reveal something raw and dangerous beneath. His gloved fingers curled back into a fist, the tendons in his jaw standing out as though the simple act of restraint might snap them. The pale figure reacted instantly, letting out a wet, guttural sound that could have been rage or pain, surging toward Lentz with renewed violence. The third man followed, his movements faster now, stripped of the measured precision that had defined them earlier. Lentz didn't hesitate. He let the shredded halves of the page fall into the snow and stepped back into the deeper shadow between two buildings, his boots slipping on the ice-slick stones. The stranger moved to intercept, his body a barrier between Lentz and the oncoming rush, but the pale figure crashed into him with such force that both went down hard, skidding across the cobblestones. The torn page halves lay only a few feet from the older man, but he didn't stoop for them. Instead, he advanced toward Lentz with slow, deliberate steps, as though the space between them didn't matter, only the inevitability of closing it. "Do you think destroying it ends your place in it?" he asked, his voice low and steady. The words cut through Lentz like cold iron, carrying the same conviction Crane's final warning had held. Lentz backed up until the alley wall pressed against his spine, the stranger still locked in a brutal grapple with the pale figure just beyond his peripheral vision. Snow hissed against the older man's shoulders, melting on contact. His coat was perfectly dry, as though the night itself refused to touch him. "It's already written," he said, his eyes fixed not on Lentz's face, but on his chest, as if reading something invisible there. The third man closed in from the side, trapping Lentz in a narrowing wedge of space. The stranger shouted something, urgent, desperate, but Lentz couldn't hear the words over the roar of his own heartbeat. The older man stopped just out of arm's reach, the lamplight catching the faintest glint of metal in his hand. Then his gaze lifted, locking on Lens's eyes. "You'll walk out," he said quietly, "but you won't walk free." The older man's voice hung in the air like frost, its weight settling into Lens's chest. Every instinct screamed to move, to push past them before the trap closed entirely. He shifted to the left, feinting toward the gap between the third man and the alley wall, and for a fraction of a second it worked. The third man's stance opened, his balance shifting. Lens drove himself through the narrow space, the icy bricks scraping his shoulder, the cold air biting at his face. The older man didn't chase. Instead, his voice followed, steady and unhurried. "Run." "It's already done." The words lodged in Lens's skull, their meaning obscured but heavy with certainty. He didn't look back. His boots pounded over the uneven stones, past shuttered shop fronts and gas lamps wreathed in snow, the sound of pursuit absent. But the silence was worse. No heavy footsteps, no ragged breathing, just the faint creak of something overhead, travelling with him in the dark. At the far end of the street, the glow of a police watchbox spilled onto the snow, a promise of safety. He pushed harder, his lungs burning, the cold slicing into them. When he reached the light, he stopped just long enough to glance over his shoulder. The street behind was empty. No older man, no pale figure, no stranger. The book was gone. The torn page was gone. Even the shattered window of Crane's shop was nowhere in sight, only a row of undisturbed brick facades under a blanket of white. Confusion tightened around his ribs. He staggered into the watchbox, the officer inside looking up with mild irritation at the intrusion. "Name," the officer asked, pulling a ledger across the counter. Lens gave it automatically, his breath still ragged. The officer dipped his pen into ink, turning the page, and Lens's stomach knotted. The paper was thick, yellowed, each line filled with precise handwriting. Names, dates, measurements. His own name was already there, written in the same exacting hand that had filled Crane's book. The officer didn't look up as he asked, "You'll be needing a coat, won't you?" The words were polite, almost casual, but the tone carried something colder. Behind the officer, hanging from a hook in the shadowed corner, was a long, dark coat. The lining caught the lamplight with a pale, familiar sheen. The lamplight flickered across that lining, and in the wavering glow, Lens saw the faintest ridge of a scar stitched into the fabric, a mark no tailor's hand could create by accident. His breath caught, the cold air suddenly harder to draw in, as if the coat itself were leaching the warmth from the room. The officer still hadn't looked up, his pen scratching Lens's name into the yellowed ledger with quiet precision. Outside, the snow had thickened into a curtain, muffling the world beyond, isolating this moment until it felt suspended in amber. Lens's eyes darted back to the coat. The way it hung on the hook was wrong, not draped, but waiting, as if it knew its next owner was already in the room. "Try it on," the officer said, the words so calm they barely seemed like an instruction at all. Something in Lens wanted to run, to shatter the watchbox door and disappear into the night, but his legs stayed rooted. The older man's final words looped in his mind. "You'll walk out, but you won't walk free." And now he understood. This wasn't about Crane or even the ledger. This was about the work. It didn't end with one man, or one shop, or one city. It lived on, passed hand to hand, stitch to stitch, until every name in the book had a place in the lining of a coat hanging in some quiet corner, waiting for its turn. The officer closed the ledger, the sound small yet final, and stepped toward the hook. His fingers brushed the sleeve, and for a moment Lens swore he saw the pale figure's eyes staring back from the shadows of the lining. "It's yours now," the officer said. The coat came down from the hook, the lining catching the light one last time. And as the snow pressed closer against the glass, sealing the night shut, Lens realized the street outside wasn't the only thing that had been swallowed whole. The city would never know his name had already been measured, but someone would. They always did. And if you've been here, watching and listening, you already know, stories like this don't stay buried. There's always another name, another stitch, another coat waiting in the dark. So before you leave, subscribe to the Macabre Record and tell me in the comments, what would you do if you found your name already written?